Welcome to Chapter 8.4, The High and Late Middle Ages, Learning and Culture. Europe in the High Middle Ages experienced a blossoming of education, literature, and the arts. This was influenced by increasing prosperity, contact with other cultures, and the rediscovery of ancient learning. Education gained more importance, and by the 1100s, schools had sprung up near cathedrals. Some evolved into our first universities. Muslim scholars had translated the works of Aristotle and other Greeks into Arabic. In Muslim Spain, they had translated them back into Latin, the language of the European scholars. In the 1100s, the new translations initiated a revolution in learning. The Greek philosophers had used reason to try to discover truth. Christians believed that the church was the final authority, and Christian scholars struggled to use this newfound learning to try to reconcile that learning with their faith. To resolve the conflicts that they thought were there, they began to use the reasoned support of logic and other ways of proving truth and mixing that with their Christian beliefs. This method is known as scholasticism. The most famous scholastic was a man named Thomas Aquinas. He wrote a book called the Summa Theologica to prove that faith and reason should exist in harmony. Scientific learning also reached Europe. Some of these scientific treatises were translations by a Greek man named Hippocrates on medicine and Euclid on geometry. Europeans adopted the more streamlined Hindu-Arabic numeral system over the very cumbersome Roman numeral system, and this allowed scientists and mathematicians to make great strides in math and science. Latin remained the language of the European scholars. However, new literature started to emerge in what was called the vernacular, or the everyday languages of ordinary people. This change brought a flowering of literary works. And some of them included a work named The Song of Roland, which was a French epic poem of chivalry. Another was The Divine Comedy, written by a man named Dante Alighieri, which was an Italian classic poem of heaven, hell, and purgatory. In a portrait of English medieval life, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. Architecture and the arts also flourished. Fortress-like Romanesque churches gave way to beautiful, airy Gothic style. This key feature of flying buttresses, which are exterior stone supports that permit a thinner and higher wall, and massive windows, which brightened the interior and made the cathedral ceilings much higher, gave a new light to the Middle Ages. Other arts during this period included stained glass windows to fill those large window expanses, and religious paintings and woven tapestries. Famous examples of this would be the Bayeux Tapestry, which was an embroidered illustration of the Norman conquest of England. The Gothic style was also applied to decorations of books, and this became known as illumination. By the late Middle Ages, there was a great need for educated people. The king needed educated administrators, and the church needed educated clergy. And universities were a response to this need. Medieval universities were basically educational guilds. Before the 1100s, schools were mainly attached to monasteries and were strictly for those who were going to enter the clergy. But after the 1100s, schools became attached to cathedrals and were run by bishops and clergy, but were for lay students. These schools were often formed in bustling cities, like the Italian city of Bologna. which wealthy businessmen had established for trade. In the course of the 12th century, cathedral schools also formed in France, in the city of Paris, and in Italy, in Bologna, and also Salerno. Salerno was probably the first university that was formed in the 940s. I'm not sure when. Students were kind of treated like apprentices. Their lives were not very comfortable. They rose very early and they worked very hard. And their learning was mainly memorization. So at about 5 o'clock in the morning, they would be woken up by a bell and they would be expected to pray. And then they would have about 5 hours of classes until about 10 a.m. when they would have breakfast, their first meal of the day. And then they would be expected to go to another 7 classes, and they would end at 5 p.m. when they would have supper again, and then study until bedtime. This was a typical program of study for students, and they were expected to learn the 7 different liberal arts. Those liberal arts were grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Students could then, if they wanted to, pursue even farther education in law, medicine, or theology. There was a great fascination with Roman law at this point, but there was also a great draw for the study of medicine. Many Muslim and Greek texts had been discovered or read, and so there was a study of the use of herbs and cures and experiments with surgery. And there was a king, just to give a side note, the king of Sicily, named Roger II, was concerned about the quality of doctors that were being produced, and so he made some laws about those who would practice medicine in his territory of Sicily. He wrote, or he said, "Who from now on wish to practice medicine have to present themselves to our officials and examiners in order to pass their judgment. Should he be bold enough to disregard this, he will be punished by imprisonment and confiscation of his entire property. In this way, we are taking care of our subjects, and so that they are not endangered by the inexperience of physicians." So even then, there was a standard board that physicians were supposed to submit themselves to. But the one that was the most difficult was the study of theology. You had to spend the most time studying theology, and that's not actually surprising for the time period. There was a great emphasis on spirituality during the Middle Ages. This can be actually seen in the development of the Gothic cathedral. If you look at the cathedrals that these schools were associated with, the cathedrals would have taken hundreds of years to produce and were a great expenditure of the town's wealth on this building. And it just shows you that the priority that they put on their spiritual lives. Educating women was not common, but if women wanted to gain an education, they could join a convent. That was pretty much the only avenue that you could get in order to gain education. Although there was a convent in Paris associated with the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and it helped to educate women. But for the majority of women in the late Middle Ages, education was rare. Cordoba, Spain, was a great educational center with about 27 free schools and a library that contained over 400,000 books. This was in contrast to Switzerland and other places that had abbeys and monasteries that had libraries, but only of about 600 books. So the difference was quite extreme. The use of paper was a new idea that was kind of developed by the Muslims who had adopted it from the Chinese through Iran and across the continent. So Cordoba's scholars contributed to fields like chemistry and medicine and surgery, music, philosophy, and mathematics. Translations from Greek and Syrian and even Persian sources enabled Muslim scholars to absorb the major features of all the important civilizations in the past. So that would include the Fertile Crescent, the Hellenistic civilizations, including Greek and Roman, and also Indian and Persian civilizations. So with all of this learning, some scholars believe that between the years 900 and 1200 AD, this was one of the world's most brilliant time periods in regards to education for the Muslim world. Prior to the 1100s, Muslim scholars had translated and spread the works of Aristotle and other Greek writers, and these were eventually translated into Latin, and they reached the Western world through the Muslims. Christian scholarship, on the other hand, was far below that level. The Christian scholars were just beginning to understand the ancient past that they had kind of forgotten for many centuries. But as these Christian scholars are learning more from their reading, they tried to reconcile their reason and faith. There seemed to be a conflict between those two. And so to try to resolve that conflict, Christian scholars developed something called scholasticism, which it was the use of reason to support Christian beliefs. The most famous scholastic was a man named Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa Theologica. He concluded that faith and reason existed in harmony and that God ruled over all order and logic in the universe. The sciences began to be studied much more diligently, and the scientific works from ancient Greece and Rome were beginning to reach Europe about this time. Europeans adopted the Hindu-Arabic numerals, which were a lot easier than the Roman numerals, and also the number 0, which made complicated calculations much more possible. Europeans studied Greek geometry and medicine, as well as the works of Arab scientists. Arab philosophers had created the study of algebra, and the word algebra means that you transport the negative term in an equation to the opposite side. So that's what the word algebra means. In the Middle Ages, literature was just beginning to be developed, and they were taking oral tradition, which was stories that were told out loud rather than written down, and they were writing them down, and often in the vernacular. So the vernacular is the language of the people. And some of the favorite stories were stories about heroes that had fought bravely and usually died bravely as well. One of the favorite stories was the Song of Roland, which was a story about one of Charlemagne's favorite warriors who stands up bravely against the Muslim invaders and dies bravely. And another story would be the story of El Cid. As the story has it, El Cid was actually the nickname of a man named Rodrigo, who was extremely good at fighting, and his Spanish lord got jealous of his skills and eventually banished him. And he knew that he had been unjustly accused, and so he began to grow his beard out long until he was pardoned of this offense. So, and it grew for many, many years. And in the process, he became well known and gained the title of El Cid, which just means Lord or great boss in Arabic. So El Cid became known as such a great leader that eventually he was given the position of his old master. Another famous poem that was written during the late Middle Ages was a piece known as Dante's Divine Comedy. This was written by Dante Alighieri, who was Italian, and it's a story about the poet having a dream and going down into purgatory and hell and seeing all the different people who were tortured there, and then also going up into heaven and seeing all the people there who made it into heaven. And many of the people of his time period that he knew or that he knew of show up in his story. So it's a little bit of a satire or a jibe at the political and religious figures of that time period. In the book, it says at the beginning, "In the middle of the journey of life, I found myself in a dark wood where the straight way was lost." And he goes from that wood being led by the Roman poet Virgil all the way into hell. And it's interesting that even though Virgil is seen as a man of great dignity and virtue, he didn't make it into heaven. But some of the other people that we find surprising do get into heaven. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is another favorite and famous piece of literature. This is a story told by Chaucer about some pilgrims that are on their way to Canterbury on pilgrimage to earn religious merit. In this group of people, they're all staying at an inn, and they meet each other for the first time on this pilgrimage, and they decide that since they're going to be traveling together, and it will take several days, that they should pass the time by telling stories, and it will be kind of a competition between them to see who has the best story. So the book or the poem is basically a collection of different stories that the different travelers tell one another. Some of them are very interesting, and some of them are not appropriate for a high school audience, but they are a good glimpse of what life would have been like in the late Middle Ages. Some of the characters in the story were a knight, a plowman, a merchant, a miller, a monk, and a nun. And these characters tell their stories in the vernacular, which is the language of the people. During this time, beautiful artwork was being produced, and this was often found in their architecture. Earlier architecture was modeled after the Roman ideal, which had a rounded barrel vault as their main source of weight bearing in their architecture. So if you look on this side of the drawing, it shows the Romanesque version of a building which had rounded arches, and as a result, the weight would be distributed throughout this archway in order to uphold a heavier ceiling. Well, in the late Middle Ages, a new type of vault was beginning to be used, and it had a more pointed top, and this was a reflection of the influence of the Muslims and their architecture, which Romanesque architecture had very thick pillars and thick walls, and it needed to have those thick walls because these archways are not able to support as much weight as this type of arch. And so it caused the buildings to be very solidly built, but very dark inside, because you can't have very big windows. The weight of the roof would have been too much for windows in that kind of structure. And so the Gothic style of architecture helped to lighten up the interiors of their buildings. Now, instead of having really small windows, they were able to have larger windows, and those larger windows then were decorated with stained glass. This style of arch is on the outside to help with the support of these walls that were becoming thinner and thinner. These are called flying buttresses because they're outside of the main structure, and they help to lighten the load of the roof, which is on top. The artwork in the Middle Ages also included stained glass and stones. So I just added a stone in here, but I didn't really find very much pictures about medieval stonework. But if you look on any church, there are, of the Middle Ages, there are lots of gargoyles and statues of saints, and these are all pieces of artwork or sculpture that were created from the Middle Ages. But this piece of stained glass was made possible because of the larger windows that were created by the Gothic style of architecture. So these windows usually depicted biblical scenes, but not always. Sometimes they were historic, more historic in the more recent past for the Europeans, but they all had tried to have some kind of religious theme. One of the other very notable forms of artwork was something called illuminations. And illuminations were basically taking written words and or the written document and elaborating using colors and motifs and often pictures of the thing that is being written about. So these are two examples. This one, both of them, neither of them are from the mainland Europe. This one is from a later Islamic text, and this is from Celtic Ireland, but they both give an example of what illumination looks like. Usually it has written on the side, and then it'll have a large picture to kind of draw the reader in and get them started on the text.